Hi, everybody. This is Paul with Microsoft. This is a recreation of the demonstration that I did for the ILTA meeting back at the end of February. And what I did is I took some of the feedback from that discussion and as well as just kind of some lessons learned from the initial dialogue. And I'm going to walk through the solution set for you of how we actually protect client matter data in the cloud. In order to do that, let me give you some backdrop. And so I'm going to turn off my camera and show you some content here real quick. So, I just as a refresher for you all, that we created this solution to address the concerns over blind subpoenas. So specifically what we mean there is that there are certain circumstances where you have a national security letter or a FISA request, which is the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which is really about, terrorism and things like that. So when those events happen, the government can actually create a request with one of these national security letters or a FISA request to make a request for data. Now, when those data requests are received by Microsoft, we battle them. We fight them, and there's a blog article. If you do a search for Microsoft blind subpoena, you will come across a blog article written in January that discusses how often we fight them. And but when we do have to respond to them, we typically are turning over non-content data, even during the response to that blind subpoena request. There aren't very many of those. A handful every year that we address, and so but given that, it's been a reason why a lot of law firms have not wanted to go to the cloud. So we created this solution specifically to address some of those concerns. The other pressure that we are also feeling is that lawyers, especially now that working from home, have been challenged in many ways. And so what we have to do is if you're a part of a law firm and the IT staff, that COVID-19 has thrown everybody for a loop. But for lawyers, it's forced this new way of working. So I think we have two kind of opposing forces going on. One is the risk of blind subpoena and how we can address that. The other one is the kind of the reactions to and this new normal, which frankly is probably going to be there's going to be some balance between the way we happened before COVID, the way we did it with COVID during COVID, and the way we'll deal with it after COVID. There will probably be something in between, right? So we wanted to create a solution that helped address those concerns, and that's what we're gonna really walk through is the data element of this, and And for those of you who have not seen the 4-phase approach, this is a slide that is meant to be kind of not consumed as a whole, but be consumed almost as the individual bullet points. So think of this as a la carte menu of options that we have provided to our law firms to start to almost like crawl, walk, run into what would be considered modern collaboration. So these aren't mandates. Some of them have some implications. But what I want you to understand is, especially on on phase 1, and really we're talking only about phase 1 and 2 today. We're not addressing the concerns in phase 3 or 4. But in phase 1, this is meant to enable things like modern meetings. Think of this as a Zoom equivalent, essentially. In this first phase, we have specifically turned off SharePoint and OneDrive. Right, so what that means is that no data is, data basically is staying where it's at. We're not changing the way you work around email or your document management systems, et cetera. And by the way, another aside is that we spend a lot of time in this solution figuring out ways to turn things off. This is not a natural act for Microsoft. We tend to want to enable everything, right? In phase 2. We start to enable a few things. One is some DMS integration into Teams, and that very much is a conversation that goes individually. So the conversation is different from iManage than it is from NetDocuments, than it might be from Prosperoware, that it might be from like open text, for example. So each of those is an individual conversation with their own roadmaps and strategies. The other thing that we are doing in phase 2 is turning on OneDrive and SharePoint for specific audiences where you want it. In other words, let's just say that you don't want it for your lawyers, but you do want it for your marketing and HR staff, right? We enable that scenario. If you want to stay in this state where OneDrive and SharePoint are off in perpetuity, you certainly can do that. But for certain audiences, we show you how to enable those things in a graceful way on a per persona basis, but not allowing client metadata to live in those locations. And so we put up some guardrails, if that's what you want, to stop client metadata from landing in some place like SharePoint and OneDrive. And if it does, we have a way to remediate it out. The other thing that's important in this phase 2 is that we can encrypt data in a way that makes it dead to the cloud. We're going to walk through that today. But this capability called double key encryption is a new capability for us, relatively early. There's another thing that we just announced this week called end-to-end encryption for calls. This will also be added to this slide over the point of in the next few days or weeks. But the idea here is that we are trying to enable scenarios where if data does land in the cloud or lands in a place that you're not comfortable with, that we can actually ensure that it's protected in a way that makes it useless to us as a cloud provider, right? There's a lot of other details here, but most people have seen these slides, so I'm just going to kind of move forward. When you adopt the cloud, especially Office 365, you take the burden off of your IT staff and you really move it towards Microsoft. And when we're talking about something like Office 365, we are in this last bubble here on the right, which is software as a service. In other words, wherever you see these light blue boxes, these are things that we are now responsible for, as opposed to you. And where you see the blue and the dark blue and the light blue, it means that we share some responsibility. But when we get to data, which is really what this conversation is about today, that burden lands largely on you. What we're doing is giving you the controls, but you dictate how those controls are enabled. Okay, so what I'm going to walk you through is how we would enable some of those controls. The other thing I want you to notice is that, when you put your data into our cloud, we have 60 plus, almost 70 plus regions around the globe. When you put your data into someplace like a German region, a region consists of multiple data centers, but when you put a data inside of Germany, for example, it may float between those data centers in that region, but it will never leave that region. And when you put it into Germany, it becomes beholden to all of the sovereignty laws of Germany. Now take the word Germany and replace it with 50 other options, United Kingdom, France, the Netherlands, etc., Asia, Australia, India, for example. When you put it into that region, it becomes beholden to the data sovereignty requirements in that region. It will never leave that region unless you pick it up and move it there, someplace else, in other words, okay? One of the controls that's important for us is this ISO 27018, and that control means that we don't own your data. You own your data. And so what we have to do is put a whole bunch of barriers in the way so that we can never touch your data. In other words, and we get audited on that, by the way. In other words, I think the one key takeaway here is there is nobody at Microsoft who has any access to your information. We have to break glass, in other words, in order to abide by a FISA request, which sets off a ton of alarms. This is not a normal experience for us to abide by FISA requests and national security letters, right? Because we get audited on the fact that we don't own your data. And what it really means is we don't have any standing administrative privilege to access your data. This would be no different, though, than if the FBI broke down the door to your data center and took your servers. The The only difference is they cannot do that in our cloud. So what we do, because they would never be able to find it. They couldn't find your data. There's no labels in our data center. There's nothing that guarantees that it's in a particular building. They would never be able to locate it. They couldn't ask anybody at the facility, where is it, right? Because they wouldn't know. There's a complete separation of duty that says that, they don't even, people who work in those data centers have no clue what's running there, nor how to find anything, right? They're just facilities people. All they do is keep the lights on. Okay. Anyways, so let's move on. One of the last slides that I have for you before I go into demo is that Microsoft Information Protection is a marketing term, largely, with a bunch of technical capabilities underneath it. So the idea behind Microsoft Information Protection is that we need a consistent way, if I'm starting from the left here, to label your data as we find it. Notice for both structured and unstructured data, we're not talking about the structured data element at all today. All we're talking about is the unstructured, in other words, files. But there is a completely different discussion around how we protect databases. So the first thing we have to do is we can label data, and we have it's something called universal labels that we apply here that can span between structured and unstructured data. Also, any place that you put the file. So the label lives with the file. So if it lands on a thumb drive, for example, it's still there. We also need an encryption mechanism that says if this lands someplace that am not comfortable with, who can open it? So the encryption lives with the file. People have been familiar with our collaboration data loss prevention capabilities for a long time because that's just been built into Exchange forever, it appears, it feels like. So not a lot new there, but something that is new for many people is that we can protect data as it's moving between your applications. So if I don't want client matter data to go into something like SharePoint or ServiceNow or Salesforce.com, I could use our solution, our Cloud Access Security Broker, a CASB solution called MCAS, Microsoft Cloud App Security. To block it, I can say you can't put client matter data here. You can put it there, but not here. So in other words, I could say with a rule, I could say client matter data can go to some place like iManage, but it cannot go to ServiceNow, right? On the right, one of the things that's more people aren't usually aware of, and I'm going to show you this today, is that we also have endpoint DLP capabilities. So if data lands on a desktop, I can stop it from being printed, edited, saved, put on a thumb drive, even move to a Bluetooth device, right, in the near future. So those endpoint DLP capabilities give us some pretty rich stuff that we can use to control things if they do land on an endpoint. Lastly, we have this idea of insider risk, which means, let's just say a lawyer decides to pack up all of his notes and documents relative to a customer and take that data to your competitor. We can find that algorithmically. This is our insider risk tool is largely a bunch of machine learning and artificial intelligence that looks for strange behaviors, right? So I'm not going to show that today, but maybe a topic for another time. So let's, the last slide before we start demoing. The very first thing that you need to know is what are you looking for? Right? So that know your data element is that you need to know what matters to you. And for the purposes of this conversation, we're largely going to focus on client matter data, but you could replace that with something like credit cards, bank routing numbers, social security numbers, passport IDs. And we understand many of those out of the box with no customization. But for things like client matter data, you may have a different naming standard for client matter data than somebody else. So we need a way to know what you're looking for. Once we know what we're looking for, the second step is really, where is it? Right? So once I know where I found it, then I can start to protect it. Right? So that protect your data, prevent data loss, and govern your data are all a part of this strategy. We are really going to focus on these top 3 bubbles today. We're not going to focus on the govern your data. But ideally here, what we're just trying to do is say, what do I care about? Where is it? How do I protect it? Okay. So let's start drilling in here. Sorry, I used my mouse wheel and that went crazy for a second. So let's actually bring up the Microsoft 365 compliance portal. So what you will notice is compliance.microsoft.com is the single web page where you define all things related to document governance and compliance. Security, document security as well. So think of this as something that like a chief data officer would care about, right? So there is a separate tool called security.microsoft.com where all the security signal goes. And then lastly, there's an administrative portal where you just really configure how your tenant and subscription within our cloud works, right? So, but there's essentially, those are the three core websites: security.microsoft.com, where we do all of our security configuration, admin.microsoft.com, where we do the core administration of what features and functionality do you want to enable in your tenant of our stuff, and then lastly, compliance.microsoft.com, where I deal with data. So what you're seeing here is that, like, when I click on home, we're giving you some information about things like, you know, how compliant you might be to different controls like GDPR, HIPAA, ISO 27001. We're telling you with giving you some information about users who are sharing files. Maybe if you want to become more compliant, we can tell you, like, if you need to comply to something like ISO 27001, we will tell you what you need to do to finish that, right? In that shared responsibility model. It's just really, at the home page here, just really telling you what you should focus on, like many of the home pages that we start with. What we're going to do is we're going to start to say, what do I care about? Remember, that was the first step here. What's important to me? Okay, so that's what we do there in order to define that is something called data classification. And there are really two different types that you need to concern yourself with. Option number one is something called a sensitive information type. This is when you know exactly what you're looking for. Okay? Trainable classifiers is another option, which I'm going to click through, but I'm not going to demonstrate it for you today. But a trainable classifier means I don't know exactly what I'm looking for, but I have some examples here that I could provide to the cloud, and it will figure it out. So an example of that might be, I have a lot of contracts. I've gathered a lot of them over the years. I have this huge example set, right? There's not a lot of rhyme or reason to all of them, but there are a lot of commonalities. And so with a trainable classifier, you could drop those into a SharePoint site and then say something between 50 and 500 of them. And we use that as seed content. And what we do is we have machine learning look at those and just try and figure out what it is. And then we will say, okay, well, then you play a game with it and you add a few more and you provide some true positives and some false positives. And you can train it. So there's an element of machine learning and then an element of machine teaching. With sensitive information types, I know exactly what I'm looking for. So what we're going to do here is we're going to create one. And the way that you do that is you, by the way, you'll notice that there's 205 here. I think that we may have created a handful of these, one so far. So, and we announced 45 more this week. So this is kind of one of the values of the cloud. It's evergreen. It keeps getting better and better. But, you know, if you need to know what a bank routing number is, you don't have to figure that out. Algorithmically, we know what a bank routing number is. Same thing with a credit card. Right? A credit card is not just 16 digits. It's 16 digits that algorithmically equal a Visa, right? So if we do something like credit card here, it is something where we know what a credit card actually is. We know not just that it's 16 digits, but it's 16 digits that is an American Express or a Visa, for example. Okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to create one. We're going to create an information type called client matter data. And what we have to do is we have to give it a name. And you can see I've done this before. And the description is really meant for the administrator. And we're going to oversimplify this. Okay, so I recognize that this is probably not exactly realistic, but I'm just showing you the art of the possible. We can get crazy with these rules, okay? But I'm just showing you something relatively straightforward. So we'll say it has the word DMS and 9 digits. And that's what our client matter data will look like. Okay, so now what we're going to do is say you don't have any elements that define it. And so what we're going to do is add an element. What kind of an element do we want to add? We could use keywords. So what's an example of a keyword one? Let's just say that you have a merger that you're working on and it has a project name. Let's call it Project Melon, right? Or Project Zebra. What you could do is say, whenever I see the word projects or the words Project Zebra or Zebra in an email, that's probably about this merger block. You know, let's do something with that, right? In the case of a regular expression, this is more of like, this is defined using something called keyword query language, which is KQL. By the way, we have 2 KQLs in our ecosystem. One of them is this keyword query language, which is what your e-discovery people use. We have another one called Kusto query language, which is Kusto with a K. And that one is meant for log analyzing. So this is the keyword query one. Lastly, we have a large dictionary. So you might have like a CSV file full of customer names, all of your customers, right? You could put that into this tool and then we could use those as part of a rule. So we're going to do the keyword query language one. I'm sorry, a regular expression. And the regular expression actually looks something like this. We're going to look for digits, right, that are bracket 9 characters long. 9 characters, and I got to find that squirrely bracket because I don't use it all the time, and then end parentheses. And then the other thing that we're going to do is say, I also wanted to have a keyword that is DMS. So if it has the 3-letter acronym of DMS and 9 digits in any order, I'm going to call that a client matter data document. Okay, and you'll also notice we can do confidence levels, and we can tune that up and down to increase or get us better results. And we have a character proximity. In other words, these 2 things within 300 characters of each other. I could tune this way down, but let's just leave it alone for the time being. Next, finish. And now what we have is basically the building block that tells us what we care about. And once this is done, what you'll notice is it says it was successfully created, and now what we can do is we can actually test it, which is kind of cool. So if we click on it, you will see this option that shows up that says test type. And I've got a file on my desktop that we can drag in, and I'm just going to show you what that looks like here. So we have this test file, and inside of it, it has DMS and then 987. And notice that I just scrolled with a few characters here. I could change these up and put it 77. It doesn't make any difference. It's just any 9 digits. We'll save that. And what we're going to do is we're going to copy that into our test window here. So I will take this file and I got to click on test type. And now what we'll do is we'll go back here and I will take this file and I will drag it into this window and test. And what we should come back with, if the demo gods are with us, that it matches. So we found these characters and we found the words DMS. So it works. We're good. We say finish. We are done with that part. Now, all we've done so far, let me turn on my camera for a second. All we have done so far is tell this cloud capability what client matter data appears to be. Right, so the rule could get a lot more complex, right? We could keep adding more and more things to that rule set, but in our oversimplified world, this is the way it works. Okay, next. What I mentioned is that we have this ability to label information. So now I know what I'm looking for. Now what I'm going to give people an option to do is start classifying data. Like I can have the tool go out and classify data, or I can have users classify data. And I'm going to kind of show you one and I'm going to explain the other. Okay. So the place that we start to classify data is in the same web page, but it's down here at the bottom. It says information protection. Okay. And you will see that we have this idea of labels, right? So what we're going to do is eventually this is going to pop up. It's still loading. You can see this little blue bar going across. These are the labels that we have created. So this is what would show up in a tool like Microsoft Office or Adobe or CAD, right? So when we create these labels, they show up in different places. They'll even show up when we create SharePoint sites. They'll show up when you create a group of users. So you can start to apply these labels to many things, right? So that we can start to protect it. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a label. We have to give it a name. Let's call it client matter data label. And well, for the display name, like what will users see, we'll call it client matter. Okay. Description for users. Not T equals, you should ensure that all client matter is labeled. For description for admin, that's optional. So we don't really need to do that one. Let me turn off my camera just so you can focus on the demo. So next, what is the scope for this label? We have three options here. One is if I want to apply it at files and emails, which is really the only one we care about today. The other one is if I want to apply the label on groups of users or sites. It's there. We're not going to do that today. The last one is Azure Purview allows us to do this with database data. So the structured side of the discussion, which we're also not focusing on today. I'm only going to show you this with regards to files and emails. Let's say next. Now what we have is two choices. Do I want to encrypt the files or do I want to encrypt them and mark them, like watermark them with some notes? And we're going to choose both. And so you get a chance. Now, when I choose these, you will see that there's a bunch of sub-bullets that are going to show up here underneath files. So see that? Now, if I had chosen groups and sites, which I did not, you would eventually we'll go through a bunch of sub-options there too, but we're just working on the files today. So with a label, we can actually remove an existing label if I want to, which is kind of interesting. But for the sake of today, what we're going to do is configure an encryption setting. Now, this is the encryption element of it. So we are going to create a label, but also infuse some encryption on top of it. So do you want to assign the permissions automatically, or do you want to let the users assign those permissions when they apply the label? In other words, do you want to mandate a label, or do you want to create a choice for users? Let's just choose let the users decide for a second. And what you'll see is it means that when this label gets applied in Outlook, it will be the equivalent of do not forward. So if I apply this client matter data label in Outlook, what'll happen is if I get one of these, I can't forward it outside of the bubble of people who have created it. In Word, I can actually, in Excel and PowerPoint and other tools, which we don't list here, we can actually specify permissions at each file level. Okay, let's go to the other option, assign permissions now, because they're very similar. The only difference is I'm letting the user decide some of this down here. So does the content ever expire? And if we say on a specific date, and I'll give you a reason why this one is important inside of Microsoft, we get a lot of PowerPoint decks that are for beta software, like early software that hasn't been released. It's not general, what we call general availability yet. It might be in a beta format. So what they'll do is create a deck, and they'll say that this deck is only usable from now until the end of March, and then we want you to use a different deck when we go general availability, right? But and so data will expire regardless of where it lives after that date. So it could be on a thumb drive. It could be on a hard drive on a desktop. It could be on Box, Dropbox, Google Drive. It doesn't matter where the file is. If it's after that date, that file is dead. Now, when I could also say a number of days. If you have client matter that's where it's only going to be for the next year, you could say something like 365. Oh, I guess you can only do 100. So we can say for 99 days, this thing can live, and after 99 days, it will go away. Lastly, what we could do is we could say, should I allow offline access? Now, that means if I'm on an airplane without any internet connectivity, how many days will I allow this to be accessible? And you might say always. It's like you can always open it offline, in this case, for 99 days. Never offline, which means that I have to phone home and see if I can access this file every single time, or after a number of days. And you can't max it out above this, so I guess we would say 99 days here, right? Now, next is what we have to do is assign some permissions. Now, these are the permissions for people who will be able to consume client matter data. So what I could do is say I could add a specific user or group, and we'll pick on, let's just say that this guy, Matt Hink, is one of my lawyers. I could use a group of lawyers. You might have a group inside your organization, but I'm just picking on Matt today. And what we'll do is say, when Matt uses this, or when he receives this label on some content, so, if he gets one of these messages, he will be able only to view and reply, but he won't be able to edit, save, print, copy, reply all, forward, edit rights, export content, allow macros, full control. So Matt has some, basically what I've done is say, Matt, when you get this is all you can do. You can view and you can reply. That's it. Okay? And we will save that just for giggles. Now, notice one more option here. This is the important option that was recently enabled. This is one of those things that helps us with client matter data, is the use of this double key encryption. What double key encryption means is that if Matt receives one of these files, it is going to be encrypted with two sets of keys. One is a key that is native to Microsoft's cloud so that we can reason over that data. But the second key that is applied is going to be a key that lives in your data center. And actually, it's the reverse of that. The first key that we apply is the key that you own. The second key that we apply is the cloud native key. And the reason why is that so we will be able to see that it's a file, but we won't be able to open up the file, right? So that way, otherwise it would literally be like there would be nothing legible in that file. But it's just, that double key encryption means though that at that point, when you use that key, that second key, Microsoft can no longer reason over that data. We can only see the header information of that file. And that's just so that we can, how to open it, basically. We have to, it has to be able to something that you can be able to read in order to open. Otherwise, it would look like a WinZip with some weird file thing that you couldn't even read. So anyways, but that's the way double key encryption works. Now, we're not going to choose that option, but it wouldn't, well, we can. It doesn't make any difference. I just don't have a URL to point to for this double key encryption. This would be a key that lives on-premise in your data center. Okay? So let's just say next now. Now what we're going to do is say, what about watermarking? And I can say, yes, I want a watermark that says client matter. And I want it to be 30-point font in red that is diagonal across the page. Save. I could also put a header and a footer if I want to in the document. Next. Do I want to apply auto-labeling? Yes, I do. In other words, do I want to have this label be applied automatically if we find something? And this is where that client matter data content type that we created earlier applies. So what we would say is add a condition if the content contains the sensitive information types called client matter data. That's going to be my trigger. Okay. So now if I see client matter data, I am going to tell the user, you should encrypt this. Okay. Now, when content matches, I could say automatically apply or recommend, and that's what I want to choose here. I want to say recommend that the user apply the label. I could also just mandate it. You could do either. It's up to you. You can do both, but I'll just say recommend. This is the tooltip that's going to pop up. Like, this file appears to contain client, my typing, matter data. You should apply the label and its encryption. I constantly misspell encryption. I can't get over that for some reason. So that is our rule. Okay, next. Now, this is where this gets skipped, and this one is also skipped because we're not doing that. Finish. Now, when we say finish, we have created a label that will be kind of there for our users to use inside of something like Microsoft Word. Okay, so they're now going to see this label. Now, when the one thing I'm not going to show you is we have a label policy which actually publishes that label to a group of people. So in other words, we set up that label so that only Matt could read or view or reply to a content that has client matter data in it. But who can create that label? So maybe Matt's the only one who can read it, but who would actually be able to create it? All right, who could publish data that's called client matter data? Matt's the consumer. Who's the publisher? So that's when we publish the label. That's what we're doing here. We would publish that label out to a person or a group of people that could create client matter data. It probably would, in this case, would be Matt and whoever else was in that group of lawyers, right? But it doesn't necessarily have to be. So you could have data that is created by human resources that other people can consume in a way that you allow, right? Right. So you could have HR create a label that could be consumed by all of your employees. Okay. Auto labeling is the difference between the user doing it at the user level versus the service doing it. And so there is like if you look at Azure Information Protection, and if I could spell it, auto labeling, what you will see is there is a difference between, this is where you can see compare auto labeling for Office apps, which was what we just did, with the auto labeling policy. And this is when the system is automatically labeling things. And you can see there are some distinctions here. I'm not going to read through this, and I'm not going to do it today either. But the idea is that we could create an auto labeling policy when the system is actually going to automatically apply labels without any human intervention. Okay? All right. So now what we've done so far is we've created a data classification, and we have now said we have a labeling protection scheme that will go out and tag content and encrypt it when we find it. The last part of this is, can we create a data loss prevention strategy across things like SharePoint and Teams and desktops that will apply data loss prevention to that client matter? Okay, so what we're going to do here is create a data loss prevention policy. When I create this policy, I'm going to leave it as custom. Okay, so, but notice we have all of those things that I showed you, those 204 other things. We have financial data, medical and health information. We have privacy information, just lots of other things here that we can use within these DLP policies, but we're only concerning ourselves with client matter data. So we'll call this client matter DLP rule. What are the locations where I want to have something happen? And notice the kind of the breadth of places that we can do this with one wizard, right? I can create rules specifically to Exchange. I could create rules for SharePoint sites, OneDrive sites, Teams, and chat and channel messages. I can create it for devices. This is endpoint DLP. I can do it for my cloud app, my CASB, Microsoft Cloud App Security. So this is when data is flying across from like from somebody's desktop into ServiceNow or Salesforce.com or iManage or NetDocuments, for example, right? So I could create a policy here that says this is where this data can go, right? Or even on-premise repositories, your on-prem file shares or SharePoint sites that you already have, right? I can define all of those here. We're not going to do this one because Exchange is staying on-premise in this scenario. The other ones I'm going to leave. I'm going to turn off CASB and on-premise just for giggles here. Just so we're going to focus in on this. Now, because I've chosen these guys, what it says is, do you want to apply this by default? It's saying all. So all desktops, all Teams and chat messages, all OneDrive accounts, and all SharePoint sites. But if I wanted to be picky and choosy, right, I could say, I'm going to apply this data loss prevention policy for client matter data only to the OneDrive accounts of my lawyers, okay? Or to the SharePoint sites where client matter data resides. I can do that, right? So I'm going to just say next here. And it's going to say create or customize advanced DLP rules. Yes. And we're going to create a rule by hand. So give it a name. Client matter data rule. What are the conditions? When content contains, same thing as before, sensitive information type called client. We'll just do client matter data. What I'm going to do, and I could keep adding conditions, and content is shared from Microsoft 365. I could say with people outside my organization. So I could create a rule that says if somebody's trying to send client matter data outside my company, what will I allow? Or only within my organization. Like I could say, like if somebody's sending client matter data inside the walls of my company, who can view it, right? I could create a DLP policy here that allows that to happen. Let's just simplify it though. If it contains client matter data, and if I wanted to create an exception, right? Actions, what actions can I apply? Restrict or encrypt the content in Microsoft 365 locations. Yes, we are going to restrict it. And what do I want to do? I want to block everyone except these people, the content owner, the last modifier, and the site admin, or block only people outside of your organization, right? I could do that. I can also take an additional action. I could say audit or restrict activities on Windows devices. This is my endpoint DLP capabilities. And in this case, I could say you cannot put client matter data on a thumb drive. Block it. Or I could say block it, but let the user override it, which you would see the override in a log. So if I was, I might say, you're not supposed to do this. And I could be like, yes, but I have to do this because of X, Y, and Z. I've got a court case that needs to go to the judge. This is the only way I can transfer. This is the way they asked me to transfer it to them, right? We could do that. So we might just say block here. User notifications. Do I want to tell the user? Yeah, let's tell them. How? I want to notify the user when it was done. And if I want to customize email text, I can. Or if I want to customize a subject, I can. Otherwise, they're just going to get stock stuff. Do I want to show them a policy tip? Yes. And it should say, you are trying to use client matter data in a way that is not allowed by policy. So in other words, if I said you cannot copy the data to the removable USB device, it would say block and give them this data and send them an email. Do I want to allow user overrides? Yes or no? Require a business justification, override the rule automatically and report it if they report it as a false positive. So you can, if I allow user overrides, they will see a false positive option as well. I'm just not going to do that right now. Incident reports use this severity to of level for an administrative alert. So when the admin looks at the portal where the data loss prevention is happening, what severity do we want to show it to them? And be like, well, it's high. Send an alert, yes or no? Use email incidents to notify administrators, yes or no? Well, I'm sorry, when a policy match occurs or when a rule match occurs, right? So additional options, we don't really have another option. So save, block only people outside your most content shared. So let's just not do that over here. We're just take that out. Save. We're done. We are done, right? So now what we have done is created a policy that is not for Exchange or CASB or for on-premise file shares, but we could have used that. But for OneDrive, SharePoint, Teams chat, we're going to be looking for client matter data now. Users are going to get alerts, warnings saying, this is client matter data. You're not supposed to put this here. Are you sure you want to put this here? Yeah. Okay. So that's really the end of the demonstration. I just wanted to give you guys a sense for the art of the possible here around the DLP rules. Let's go back. I want to show you, I want to go back to the PowerPoint for one last slide. Do you remember, and actually I want to kind of bring back the demo here just for a second. When we created the information protection label, so when we created this label down here called client matter, come on, you just have to be patient. When we created this client matter data option, and if we click on edit here to edit the policy, I just wanted to resurrect your brain on one thing right here. When we use this double key encryption option, it has some implications. I'll turn my camera back on. They are this. Transport use rules for Exchange can no longer reason over this information. Microsoft Delve breaks. Now, many of you aren't familiar with Delve. It's a cloud service that helps you find information that you care about without having to search for it. So in other words, this is like search in the reverse. What does that mean? So maybe I am a lawyer in your company that does patent law for chemicals, right? Anytime new content comes up for patents around new chemicals, Delve will say, Paul, did you know that this new content was created? Right? I don't have to go and search for it. It finds me, right? That's what Delve does. E-discovery, meaning so things where you have to do either a legal hold, for example, or maybe you're just researching data for a particular case, et cetera. That's all about e-discovery. That breaks because we can't reason over the file anymore. Content search and indexing breaks. So if it's stored in SharePoint, right, we can't search it or index it. It's just a dead block of data to us. Web apps, including co-authoring, breaks because the servers can't reason over the data to let multiple people in anymore. We don't have the key. So what this means procedurally is that if you're going to use things like auto-labeling or label policies, and you want to do co-authoring, before you enable the label, you should finish your co-authoring. You shouldn't do auto-labeling. You should do manual labeling and then apply the label at the end. Or just edit it the same old way you've always done it, which is every person individually, right? But some things break with double key encryption. Okay, so that was the end. I'm really grateful that you guys hung out with me and that we, were able to re-walk through this whole demonstration. As always, I'm on these ILTA calls pretty frequently, so I'm happy to answer additional questions, but pauledl@microsoft.com is my alias, and so if you have additional questions, you can always reach out to me. Thanks so much for your time. Talk to you soon.